Papias is our earliest witness to the authorship of the Gospels, and consequently it is not surprising that skeptics have lobbed the most objections to his testimony. One common objection says that Papias is not referring to the books that we know by Matthew and Mark at all. Bart Ehrman explains, when Papias talks about a gospel written by Mark and another by Matthew, is he actually talking about the gospels that we know about by these names? In fact, what Papias says about the two books, Matthew and Mark, suggests he is referring to books different from the ones we have. That is easy to show with Matthew. Papias says only two things about the Matthew he is familiar with. It consists only of sayings of Jesus, and it was composed in Hebrew. Neither is true of our Matthew. Elsewhere, Ehrman contends, it is worth noting that the two pieces of solid information that Papias gives us about Matthew are not true of our Matthew. Our Matthew is not just a collection of Jesus' sayings, and the gospel was certainly written in Greek, not Hebrew. Has Papias simply gotten his information wrong, or is he talking about some other book written by Matthew, for example, a collection of Jesus' sayings that we no longer possess? In a similar vein, Randel Helms objects, but the Gospel of Matthew is written in Greek, nor is Matthew just Logia, sayings. Whatever Papias means, it is not the Gospel of Matthew. Finally, Richard Carrier objects, Papias then says that Matthew composed his Gospel in Hebrew and then translated various times into Greek. But that also can't be true, because Matthew copies extensively from Mark's Greek, frequently verbatim, and thus can't possibly have been composed in Hebrew. It's clear that Papias had no idea what he was talking about and had no reliable sources of information about the first century of Christianity. We have, then, two straightforward objections to the idea that Papias is referring to the canonical Gospel of Matthew. In the first place, he says that it was written in Hebrew rather than Greek, and he also refers to it by using the term logia, or sayings, which implies that there is no narrative. But since canonical Matthew is both written in Greek and clearly contains narrative, it follows that Papias must be talking about some other text or must simply be wrong. We may begin our response to the claim that Papias says that Matthew is written in Hebrew by reviewing something which I brought up in my third video on the synoptic problem. There I pointed out that this term from Papias, commonly translated as Hebrew language, can just as easily mean Hebrew dialect. Notably, Papias does not include a definite article before the term, and as scholars such as Robert Gundry and Bernard Orchard have argued, the context plausibly favors this alternative translation. This is all just to point out that things are not as clear-cut as Ehrman and Helms make them out to be. Papias may not, in fact, be saying that Matthew was written in Hebrew after all. Helms, at least, shows knowledge of Gundry's argument, but makes no attempt to engage with it. With all that being said, it has to be admitted that this is merely a possible translation of Papias. But what if Papias is saying that Matthew was composed in the Hebrew language? If he was, then clearly he is not referencing the canonical Gospel of Matthew. However, it does not follow from this that Papias' statement is evidentially worthless, for Papias also states that everyone interpreted or translated Matthew as best they could. Plausibly, our canonical Gospel of Matthew would have been one such translation, and some explanation will still need to be given for how our canonical Matthew came to be attributed to Matthew the tax collector. The answer seems all too obvious. The canonical Gospel of Matthew was attributed to Matthew because he himself was the one who translated it, or, at the very least, was responsible for the translation. As Martin Mosse contends, the assumption that it was Matthew who revised his own work follows simply from the observation that the early church knew of no other author. Most naturally, and in default of information to the contrary, we would expect a man to revise his own work, and to introduce an unknown redactor without evidence and for no good reason when a simpler solution is at hand is to breach Occam's razor. And what about Papias' use of the term logia, or oracles? Does this indicate that he thought that Matthew was nothing more than a collection of sayings absent any narrative? The idea that logia can only refer to sayings is certainly wrong, for Papias likewise uses the term in reference to Mark's Gospel in the very same passage, claiming that Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not in order, whatsoever he remembered, of the things said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him, but afterward adapted his teaching to the needs of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's Logia. Notice how in this quotation, Logia is used as a synonym not only for what Jesus had said, but also for what Jesus had done. So Papias uses the term Logia to mean more than just sayings. As Richard Bauckham argues, the context in these statements about Mark strongly suggests that Logia means not sayings of the Lord, but something like short reports of what the Lord said and did. This is because the Logia of the Lord must be parallel to the earlier phrase, the things either said or done by the Lord. In addition to this, both Irenaeus and Origen refer to the Gospels as oracles in their writings, which makes clear that the term was used as a synonym for Gospels by early Christians. And a final point worth noting is that Eusebius himself, who preserves these quotations from Papias for us and had access to the full context of Papias' statements, clearly interpreted Papias as talking about the Gospels of Matthew and Mark when he used the term Logia. All in all, there are just no good reasons for thinking that Papias is not referring to the Gospel of Matthew just because he uses the term Logia. But Ehrman isn't prepared to stop at the Gospel of Matthew. He thinks that Papias is not referencing the canonical Gospel of Mark either. He says, "One of the points that Papias emphatically makes is certainly wrong. He claims that one of Mark's two primary goals was to tell everything that he had heard from Peter about Jesus. There is simply no way that can be true. The Gospel of Mark takes about 2 hours to read out loud. After Peter had spent all those months or years with Jesus, and Mark listened to Peter preach about Jesus day and night, are we really to imagine that all Mark heard was 2 hours worth of information?" Ehrman is probably misunderstanding Papias here. It is more likely that Papias is saying that Mark wrote down everything that Peter remembered, as opposed to saying that Mark wrote down everything that he himself remembered. As Richard Bauckham argues, I have also suggested that the subject of both of these verbs of remembering, recalled from memory and related from memory, may be Peter, but this is debatable. Many scholars have thought that the person remembering is Mark. Grammatically, either reading is possible. If the subject is not Peter, then this sentence fails actually to convey what Papias clearly intended, that it was Peter's teaching that Mark wrote down. This is much better conveyed by saying that Mark wrote what Peter remembered, rather than that Mark wrote what he remembered Peter saying. Now, Ehrman can still reply that this reading just pushes his objection back a step. Are we really to believe that Peter remembered nothing more than is contained in the Gospel of Mark? Here it will be helpful to remind Ehrman that we do not possess the full context of Papias' quotation. Is Papias intending to say that Mark contains everything that Peter ever remembered about Jesus? Or is he saying that Mark wrote down everything that Peter remembered on a particular occasion? The section from Papias preserved by Eusebius cannot tell us one way or another. However, Eusebius also records a statement from Clement of Alexandria, which reports more details about the origin of the Gospel of Mark. Clement tells us that Mark was a written version of one of Peter's sermons in Rome. Moreover, many scholars believe that Clement is dependent upon Papias here. If that is right, then this sheds considerable light on what Papias means when he says that Mark wrote down everything that Peter remembered. He means that Mark wrote down everything that Peter remembered in this particular sermon. Thus, by taking into account what both Papias and Clement report about the origin of Mark, we can see that Ehrman's objection is based upon a misunderstanding of Papias. Richard Carrier makes a different sort of objection to the idea that Mark was writing for Peter, saying, Papias says that Mark became Peter's secretary and faithfully recorded his teachings. But that can't be true because Peter was a Torah-observant Christian, and Mark's gospel advocates against that and in favor of Pauline Christianity. That Peter and Paul were at odds on this point is clear throughout Galatians 2. Even if Carrier is right that Peter had been a Torah-observant Christian at the time that Paul wrote Galatians, sometime in the late 40s or early 50s AD, this leaves open the possibility that Peter changed his perspective at a later point in time and came around to see things from Paul's perspective by the time Mark wrote his gospel, sometime in the 60s or 70s AD. But more fundamentally, Carrier seems to have misunderstood the actual conflict between Peter and Paul described in Galatians 2. Paul does not suggest that Peter was observing the Torah. Rather, he says that he had confronted Peter over his inconsistent behavior regarding when he would eat with Gentiles and when he would not. Indeed, in verse 14, Paul pretty much states that Peter was not actually observing the Torah in his own life, but only hypocritically made himself appear to be for fear of the Jews. He writes, "I said to Cephas, or Peter, in the presence of all, if you, being a Jew, live like the Gentiles and not like the Jews, how is it that you compel the Gentiles to live like Jews?" So Carrier is not accurately representing the dispute between Peter and Paul. Once it is properly understood, it is clear that it presents no difficulty to the idea that Peter was Mark's source. Consequently, there is no objection to Papias' reliability.